Good evening, and thank you for joining us for Truth and Transformation Westside Atlanta. My name is Cam Argetsinger. I'm the Senior Manager of Public Engagement at the Center, and we are so excited that you are here with us today. And we would also like to thank PNC for sponsoring our Black History Month programs. They are making all of this possible and have done so all month. So a very, very special thank you to them. And just a friendly reminder that all comments of the moderators and guests of our programs represent the thoughts of each individual and do not represent an official position of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. Now, our moderator this evening is Dr. Kalinda Lee. She is part of our team at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. And Kalinda, I will throw it over to you.
Thanks, Cam. I am excited to be here today to talk to you about a really wonderful initiative that the National Center for Civil and Human Rights has launched. Again, I'm Kalinda Lee, and I serve as Head of Interpretation, which includes exhibitions and education and many programs at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. One of the programs that I have the distinct honor of being able to shepherd and help to form as part of a collaborative is the Truth and Transformation Initiative. And I'm going to talk to you now a little bit about what that initiative is and who's engaged with it. And then we'll have a little bit more information about the history that explores, as well as some comments from two of our participants who are partners in the project through their organizations. And then we're going to open it up to a Q&A session so that we can hear your thoughts and respond to your questions. The Truth and Transformation Project is divided into two portions. Part of that is focused on the 1906 Race Massacre. And the other part of the project is the Westside Atlanta Project, which focuses on a history of convict leasing in Atlanta. And that's what we're going to focus on today. In the period after the Civil War and the formal end of slavery, two abhorrent practices, both convict leasing and, quite frankly, lynching, racialized violence, were used as deliberate strategies to terrorize and subjugate the Black community to prevent Reconstruction era civil rights reforms from taking hold. Those civil rights reforms include things like the right to vote for African-American men, accessing education and economic opportunities, and basic human rights achievements. Starting in the late 1800s, convict leasing also became part of this story. It was an industry unto itself with prison labor camps and schemes that reinstated bondage for generations of African Americans. Essentially, within this context, African Americans would be often charged with crimes that were specious or with very little evidence, or crimes that were codified after the Civil War, including things like essentially crimes that meant that they were staying outside of their place of subjugation to whites, and they would be sentenced to hard labor. And part of the framework for that was because while slavery had been abolished in this nation, there was a caveat which indicated that except for penalty of a crime, and so people could be compelled to forced labor without any recompense if they were sentenced to that as a consequence, supposedly, of committing a crime. Lynching was also widespread and a form of domestic terror wielded by vigilantes, abetted and often instigated by government authorities, and it instilled fear and enforced segregation and racial subordination. The history of these practices has been deliberately shrouded. It is not taught in most schools, nor is it well commemorated in public spaces. Although both convict leasing and lynching happen in prominent locations around Atlanta, among them Bellwood Quarry, the Chattahoochee Brick Factory, and the downtown Five Points neighborhood. We do not have a strong understanding of what many of these sites actually carry with them in terms of history. In contrast, at the same sites, there are statues and place names that venerate white supremacists and segregationists. These painful histories, when explored accurately and empathetically, can help us to address the persistent inequalities that exist as legacies of past abuses. And understanding this past can inform our shared understanding about who is seen or silenced and what we choose to venerate or disdain as we mold the future. This is the focus of the Truth and Transformation Initiative, a 3-year project to help Atlanta critically engage with post-Reconstruction era history using a strategy of memorialization, commemoration, public education, and civic engagement. Essentially, we have 2 threads of incredibly painful and difficult history at the before the turn of the 19th century, and really well into the 20th century, that were formed in order to make sure that African Americans stayed subordinate to whites by not accessing their civil and human rights, and quite frankly, enforced with the support of law in enacting violence against people who would deign to step out of line. What we are attempting to do with this project is to draw attention to both of those threads of history, to understand how and why they were enacted, to understand their legacies on our landscape, and to address those legacies so that we can create a better, more equitable future. The center has been called upon to apply these lessons in settings outside of our museum. Atlanta area grassroots leaders, educators, municipal officials, culture workers, and philanthropists are actively engaged, urging conversations about the meaning of power, about how history is taught or not taught, and about how our historical monuments tell us things about the values that we not only held dear in the past, but continue to hold dear. Central to this discussion is a consideration of people and events in our city that have not been recognized or memorialized, with specific interest in addressing the 2 unacceptable omissions that I just raised. Last week, the National Center for Civil and Human Rights hosted an event to publicly introduce Truth and Transformation, 1906 Race Massacre. This evening, we are publicly introducing Truth and Transformation, the Westside Atlanta Project, which again focuses on the history and consequences of the convict leasing system instituted after emancipation. Though the system was not limited to Blacks, it was disproportionately used to force African Americans back into involuntary servitude. To accomplish our work, the center is convening stakeholders across sectors, nonprofit cultural organizations like ours, school systems, higher education, government, the philanthropic community, direct service nonprofits, neighborhood organizations, grassroots community leaders, and more are working together to develop meaningful commemoration of convict leasing at Westside Reservoir Park's Bellwood Quarry and the adjacent Chattahoochee Brick Company. Through our working sessions, we will develop shared understandings about approaches to community collaboration that promote equity between these stakeholders, build empathy in public discussion, and model productive engagements with historical truth. In short, not only are we looking to create some sort of monumental memorialization, but we are also trying to change the ways in which we work together so that we can do so in a more equitable way that really respects the variety of ways that people who are part of this landscape approach the sense and significance of memorialization. We are inviting you to join us in this important effort to expose the truth of history, to honor the untold victims of convict leasing, whose freedom and human rights were stolen from them, and to gather knowledge and strength from their stories so that we can build a more just future together. I'm going to turn the program over now to Cam Argetsinger again, so that he can introduce Douglas Avery Blackman. We'll tell you a little bit more about this history of convict leasing in our landscape.
Hello again, everyone. Get this up real quick. Here we go. It is my pleasure to introduce Douglas A. Blackman. He is a Pulitzer Prize winning writer and filmmaker. He literally wrote the book on this subject, Slavery by Another Name. And we are honored to have him with us tonight. And Professor Blackman, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks for having me, and nice to join the folks who are on the call. My role in this process has been, as was just described, I've written a great deal about, in particular, convict leasing, and specifically some of the things that happened at the Chattahoochee Brick Company, which was a place that relied overwhelmingly on forced labor of prisoners beginning in the 1880s and continuing until 1908. And Chattahoochee Brick also is very central to the history of Atlanta. And some of the most famous and established families and fortunes of Atlanta have deep, deep ties back to the terrible history, really, the horrific history of the things that happened out at Chattahoochee Brick. And part of the process that, part of the work that that I'm trying to do as a part of this project is to bring some of that history and research, my own and others, and also some work done by students of mine at Georgia State, who continue to now, in concert with me, to research the specific names and lives of individuals who were victimized by some of these practices in the past, and try to restore some humanity and dignity to the lives of people who were treated in such terrible ways and so often very unjustly. And so, and I'll talk a little bit about that history tonight, of both the things that happened at Chattahoochee Brick and why they are important. But then also, one of the interesting things about this effort is that it is also looking at events at the Bellwood Quarry, at this other location, not that far from Chattahoochee Brick, but where the city has now built this expansive park on the site that includes the quarry that is most famous as the quarry that was featured in the Walking Dead, as all of you probably know, and it's now a reservoir for the city and full of water. But it actually represents a somewhat different element of the history that we're talking about, and that's that it was a place that was a prison camp, in effect, or a chain gang camp, really is the way that we would be most familiar with how to describe it. And so it was a place where not so much that the local governments were leasing human beings or selling human beings, which was the way that it was described at the time. It's not a place where private companies or private enterprises would go out, at least not in a significant way, would go out and buy human beings. That's what was happening at Chattahoochee Brick and at many other places. But out at Bellwood Quarry, it's a classic scene of a hard labor chain gang camp, where the inmates there are overwhelmingly African American, overwhelmingly have been arrested on incredibly minute charges, and oftentimes, as Kalinda was describing earlier, charges that were rooted in crimes that had essentially been invented as a form of intimidation against African Americans, things that were essentially more violations of the racial order than transgressions that actually did any kind of harm. And many times, they really were laws that had been passed specifically to be used to intimidate African-American men in particular into working for white men or white families at subsistence level wages or less than that. And so the history of the Bellwood Quarry and the chain gang camps associated with that area is actually much less well known. And Cam, did you want to roll some of these images that we have, or is that the best way to do that? There we go. All right, so okay, here we go. So there's some images that, and I won't dwell on them, but when we get to the Q&A, if you see anything in these images that that you're curious, have more curiosity about, then ask about them then. But these images start off with some pictures of the essentially the Atlanta police force. This is an image on the screen now from the 1880s, and which is right about the time that the first chain gang camp was, or the first prison camp was established out at Bellwood Quarry, and the same time roughly that Chattahoochee Brick Company was being established and immediately making use of the forced labor of prisoners who were acquired from both the state of Georgia and also from the city of Atlanta and from Fulton County and sheriffs and other counties all over the state. And at the time that this was happening in the 1880s, a rising politician in Atlanta and increasingly wealthy individual was a man named Captain James English, and Captain English eventually is the mayor of Atlanta and is responsible for organizing the effort that brings the state capital, that arranges for it to be moved from Milledgeville to Atlanta. So a sort of seminal event in the establishment of Atlanta's prominence at the end of the century and into the 20th century. And then but then Captain English is also Atlanta's wealthiest person and is the most politically powerful person in the city. And after he serves as mayor, he remains the most politically influential person, and in fact serves on the police commission of the city. He chairs the city council's police commission, which in the system of governments that Atlanta had in that era remained in many respects the most powerful political position that there was in Atlanta. And he was in that role all the way until the 1920s, when he died in the 1920s. He also, though, converted the profits from Chattahoochee Brick Company, which was an enormous enterprise that produced as many as 3 million bricks a day at its full production, many millions of which were then used were purchased by the city of Atlanta to pave the streets and the sidewalks, to build many of the buildings that were public, the public buildings of the city at the time. Those bricks went into almost any building in Atlanta that predates 1910. There's a very high probability that it has Chattahoochee bricks in it, including the house that I live in Grant Park, and most certainly the brick sidewalks of Grant Park and Inman Park and other older areas of the city. The vast majority of all that came from Chattahoochee brick, and these are still more images of the Atlanta police squad of the 1880s through the early 1900s. And it goes without saying, I guess, but one thing about this is that obviously there are no African Americans in any of these pictures, and we're talking about a period of time in which law enforcement and the way that the police operated in the city of Atlanta was one that was grotesquely unfair and discriminatory in almost all of its behaviors toward African Americans. And in fact, the Atlanta Police Department by the 1910s had become a bastion of the Ku Klux Klan. And through the 1910s and into the 1920s, the Atlanta Police Department was a place that essentially you could not be a police officer in Atlanta if you were not a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And it was fully and completely infiltrated and in some respects controlled by the Ku Klux Klan organization as it operated in Atlanta. And so Captain English, I've never seen anything that indicates that he specifically was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. He was deeply invested in a group of people who were. And you'll see an image of him in a minute or two after some of these images. And Cam, if you want to speed these along a bit, we can do that too. This image is the old Fulton County Jail that was demolished in the early 1970s. It was built actually right around the turn of the century. So at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. And the tower you can see on the left, which goes a good ways higher than what you can see there, that was a hanging tower in which the men who were, and a few women over 100 years, but people who were convicted of capital offenses in Atlanta and hanged here would be hanged in that tower. So it was a permanent gallows that served as a jail for Atlanta and for Fulton County all the way up until the early 1960s. But its history and the history of the chain gang camp out of the Bellwood Quarry are closely connected to one another. And of course, the labor that was done out at Bellwood Quarry was the classic image that we, you may know from pop culture or from movies or even cartoons, but the almost cliche of a prisoner in stripes, in black and white uniform, prison uniform stripes, sent to break rocks in a quarry. One of the struggles, and that's the last picture of the Atlanta police that we'll see, but you can see it's not a very friendly looking bunch, but not many pictures from the 19th century look very friendly. But out of Bellwood Quarry, one of the challenges of the history of that area is that there were quarries all over the place out in that part of Atlanta, and also in the south of Atlanta, to some degree north of Atlanta. Some of the images that you're going to see over the next few minutes come from a variety of those places. Some of them also, it's not certain where the image comes from, but they all are representative of what conditions were like in these prison camps. And the Fulton County chain gang camp out at the Bellwood Quarry was actually the headquarters of a network of labor camps around Fulton County that came and went and moved around at various times. But the Bellwood Quarry camp was the main one, and it's also the location of the modern Fulton County Jail today, or very close to it. And but it was the central receiving location where, if you were arrested in Fulton County and convicted of a misdemeanor, and in some cases of felonies and more serious crimes, you would first be sent out to the Bellwood Quarry, and some people remained there as part of the quarry camp, the rock breaking crews, and others would be fanned out to these other satellite camps around Fulton County. Some of them were also at quarry sites around the county. Almost all of them were involved in road construction and infrastructure type work at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. The prisoners who were involved in all of this were overwhelmingly African Americans, overwhelmingly African American men. And by overwhelmingly, I mean typically 80 or 90% of the people who would be in these camps, at least at those points in time where we're able to determine, where we have the records that actually show us who was in a camp at a particular time. It's overwhelmingly African American men, but they also were involved in the construction of and that's an image of Captain English late in his life, but the prisoners. And then this actually is an image from Chattahoochee Brick, one of the very few images that survives today showing the convict prisoners at Chattahoochee Brick. The building behind them is, I believe, actually the mill that after which the Whittier Mill neighborhood is named, but a textile mill which was next door to Chattahoochee Brick, and it was built with Chattahoochee Brick. And using the labor of convicts from Chattahoochee Brick to build that textile mill. The mill building is largely gone now, though there's some ruins of structures associated with it. But this is actually the only image that I'm aware of that definitively shows prisoners out at Chattahoochee Brick. But so that's an example of where you had a private enterprise, a private company, where that being Captain English's company, Chattahoochee Brick, acquiring from the state of Georgia and from local officials at all times, at least several hundred convict laborers. Typically more than 100 would be at Chattahoochee Brick. And then he also owned coal mines and other industrial type enterprises in North Georgia and other brickmaking concerns around the state of Georgia. And so at any given time, there would be 3 or 4 different places, if not more, in Georgia where Captain English was making use of convict labor and including railroad construction during one period of time. And the conditions at a place like Chattahoochee Brick were unspeakably terrible. Ghastly would be a word that would make sense. The mortality rate was incredibly high. The numbers of people who died there for no explicable reason. The level of physical punishment used on the prisoners was extreme. There are well-documented accounts of prisoners being lashed to death at Chattahoochee Brick, as was common in many places. And in fact, as you'll see in some images coming up, the use of the lash on prisoners was incredibly routine, both in places like Bellwood Quarry and state prison facilities, and also private enterprises like Chattahoochee Brick, where people were whipped mercilessly and repetitively, purely to extract the most possible labor from every person. If they failed to reach a daily quota of work, as in numbers of bricks produced or their role in certain parts of the production, or in the coal mines, how much coal they brought out individually from the mines every day, they would be whipped for failure to reach certain quotas in the evening, and then they'd be whipped again the next morning before they went back into these work situations. They were routinely starved, routinely denied any kind of medical care. And at Chattahoochee Brick, we know that there was a substantial burial field because we actually have documentary evidence that shows markings of a location on this site where there were convict graves at one time. That exact location is lost now, but that's one of the issues of that site is the question of human remains. That almost certainly, by the way, is the case at the Bellwood Quarry as well, but we know even less about what might have happened there. This image that's now on the screen is of Joel Hurt, who is an iconic Atlanta figure and built the Hurt building in downtown Atlanta, which was the first skyscraper in the city. He's closely associated with he is the founder, in fact, of what became SunTrust Bank and now is in the process of becoming Truist Bank. Joel Hurt also founded a streetcar company and an electric light company in Atlanta that merged in the early 1900s to become what is today Georgia Power and Southern Company. He and Captain English had close business associations. There are connections between them and SunTrust Bank and the modern Coca-Cola company in terms of the wealth that was generated through these enterprises ultimately being invested in other enterprises like Coca-Cola. It's a more indirect connection, but Joel Hurt and Captain English were the two most prominent business figures in Atlanta from the 1860s, until the middle of the 20th century. And so, yeah, just Cam, go ahead and you can scroll through these, just giving 10 or 15 seconds on these as we go along. This is a newspaper article from early in the 20th century that just gives a quick example of its coverage of a group of people who had just been convicted of various crimes and sentenced to the chain gang in this case. And so these are all people who almost certainly They would have gone out to the Bellwood Quarry to begin with. If we looked closely at that clip, we'd see that most of them had been fined $2. And if you got a fine of $2 for vagrancy or one of these other trivial charges against which almost no one could defend themselves, a $2 fine could easily lead to being forced to spend 6 months or more on a chain gang. This is a chain gang from Thomasville, Georgia, that's just representative of that. If you traveled around Georgia in the early 1900s, you would have seen gangs of men like this, and you can see, if you look at their feet closely, they're all chained together. You can see some of their chains more clearly than others, but you would have seen groups of men like this working all over the state. There were thousands and thousands and thousands of prisoners working on the roads of Georgia, chained together in these ways in that period of time. This is an image, a postcard image of the Georgia State Capitol from 1883. So it's a brand new building at that time. You can tell the trees are just been planted. But the state capitol was significantly constructed with convict labor, almost certainly including convicts that came from the Bellwood Quarry, but also convicts that were still under the state. This image comes from North Carolina, but it's just essentially showing convicts at work on a road. One of the things that we forget about is that the paved roads, solid roads, are a very modern thing. And at the beginning of the 20th century, there were almost no paved roads in the South. Outside of cities, there were, in Georgia, in fact, there was not a single mile of paved road in Georgia outside cities until the 1910s. And so almost all road work was done by prisoners in manual labor like that. This is an image from that could be from Bellwood Quarry. It's at a much later date. But it's from a Fulton County chain gang camp in the mid 20th century, and you'll see a number of images that you'll be able to tell have a similar sort of timing to them. This is an article, I think, from 1914 that in which the operators of the Bellwood Quarry are talking about that, are denying that they have been mistreating prisoners but insisting that they must continue to lash prisoners, and they would have argued that black men in particular needed to be whipped constantly, and that it would be impossible to operate a place like the Bellwood Quarry without using the lash. This is an image actually from a place in Alabama, I believe, though it's unclear. But this is a pack of the bloodhounds that in every labor camp like the ones we're talking about, there would have been a pack of bloodhounds who were trained to track escapees and would be specifically trained to track. There was a belief that there were dogs that had particular skills for tracking African-American men. But this would have been a standard fixture at every forced labor camp. And this one, you can see that that's a stockade wall behind them. And so this is probably at a coal mine that had a stockade built around the entrance to the mine. And Cam, just keep rolling along if there's a way to do that. There's some more news articles that'll come through here. This is again where out of the Bellwood camp, what had happened in this case was a number of the prisoners there had gotten word out somehow that they were being severely abused, physically abused, and then there's a kind of inquiry into that. And then this is an article about the claim by the officials in charge of the camp that they had not mistreated the prisoners. But as you'll see, as we get a little deeper into these images, the mistreatment of convicts was, these allegations of mistreatment came up over and over and over again, and the evidence of how badly mistreated they were often self-evident, including that it was not uncommon for prisoners to injure themselves because they were either being starved or they were being brutalized in ways in these camps that they would cut themselves or gouge out one of their own eyes or break a bone in their bodies to try to, as a way of trying to get out of the camp and avoid the misuse, the abuse that was occurring. This is a story also early 20th century about an explosion at the Bellwood camp, that where there were lots of explosives being used in a quarry like that. And this was an explosion where 2 prisoners were killed, and then the debate over whose fault it was and how that had happened. It speaks as much as anything to just the unregulated nature of these places and how little protection prisoners had. We in America don't have much sympathy for prisoners. This, by the way, is a whipping report. It's an amazing thing of the things that human beings will document. So this is actually from the Georgia State Penitentiary in 1930, but it's a document that showing the whippings that had been administered with the lash to the named men there at a state prison camp. Whether there are any of these kinds of records that still survive related to Bellwood Quarry is an open question, something I'm still trying to figure out. But there would have been extensive documentation of this sort, and you can see how much of this is just men being whipped for not working, quote unquote, which really meant not working at the pace that the operators of these camps wanted out of them. And more images of these rock quarry construction. This one could be from Bellwood Quarry. It also may be from a location in the northern part of Fulton County that became very notorious for the abuses that occurred in another quarry work camp. There, as I say, there were multiple sites, though Bellwood was the central location for this. This is another one of those, a little bit earlier time, but these quarries were all over the place, and particularly until the early 20th century, almost all of the extraction of this kind of stone that then went into the foundations and construction of buildings in Atlanta had to be done manually. And so this is very clearly what you're seeing there is a convict camp where all of the work is being done by hand with pickaxes and explosives for the most part. Extremely dangerous work. And then this is an iconic image that appeared in my book. This is a prisoner in actually a state prisoner, not at either of the camps we're talking about, but I included it because it's representative of the kind of abuses and tortures that were applied to men. This is an image that actually had never been published until it appeared in my book now more than 10 years ago. There's another image, because if we could pull the lens back, you'd see, and there it is. Those are 2 different men, and these pictures were taken on the same day, and they're a short distance apart. You can see another one of the dogs wandering around in the back, and 2 more prisoners. This was at a state camp, a state operated camp. We don't know exactly where, but this kind of punishment of tying a man up, hog tying him, and in this case around pickaxes, and then leaving them out in the sun on a hot day for certainly a whole day at a time and maybe longer, was a common kind of punishment for prisoners in that time. Then there's some more images here. This is back at a Fulton County farm, a prison farm. Atlanta also had a prison farm by the time you get to the 1930s. And the story that was promoted by local governments was that these farms, and by the state, was that these were actually healthy places for prisoners to be, and they were raising their own food and saving the state and the local government's money by doing all these things. The problem was that huge numbers of the people who were arrested and taken there had in fact not committed any kind of serious crime, or perhaps any crime at all in many cases. The evidence suggests that. And then once they were there, they suffered the kinds of indignities and abuses that we've been talking about. Another image here, this is from a quarry camp in Fulton County. It's possible that it's the Bellwood Quarry, but unclear. You see the guard with the shotgun off to the left. And in all of these images, it's over and over again that you will occasionally see white men who were prisoners, but overwhelmingly African Americans. This is an image from the 1940s, and is actually from again a state camp, but where on the basis of almost nothing whatsoever, a group of guards, of drunk guards, opened fire on African American prisoners in that particular camp, and you can see the bodies of some of them there. And there were at least 5 prisoners who were shot to death in what was described as an escape attempt, but in reality was not that, was a drunken brawl essentially started by the guards in this particular camp. And there is abundant evidence of these kinds of acts of violence against prisoners at all of the kinds of camps that existed in Georgia, including at Bellwood and certainly at Chattahoochee Brick, but this gratuitous violence of that nature. This is an image from the 1950s. The 2 men in the picture, the 2 young men, were prisoners not at Bellwood, but at another quarry prison camp in Fulton County, and they had both broken their own legs in the camp. They'd used a sledgehammer to break their own legs, along with about 20 others, in a protest against the conditions in that particular camp at that time. And that was also not an uncommon thing, that a large number of prisoners would injure themselves at the same time in protest of the conditions that they were being forced to endure. In this case, very remarkable that, and this, ironically, cynically, grossly, I would say, that's the warden of the camp where those prisoners injured themselves, and he's showing a photographer for the Atlanta Constitution how the prisoners broke their legs with a sledgehammer, and that's what that image is, and which is again a part of the callous disregard for the humanity of these prisoners, both by the warden, but also by institutions like the Atlanta Constitution, where I used to work. But the degree to which there was really no serious concern for the lives of these prisoners or the conditions they were under. And then I think that's the last image. So those are actually women there. It's a little hard to tell in the silhouette, but there were there were women, and occasionally a white woman would be caught up in this system somehow. But overwhelmingly, even higher percentages of those women who were mistreated in these places were African-American women, and they suffered indignity similar to the men and much worse in some respects. And so I think that's the end of that, but that's a quick history of, it's sort of a, it's a terrible, sometimes I feel guilty even talking about how, just how gratuitously violent and sort of obscene really this story is. And when we see so many images like that, it's a reminder of just how obscene it was. But for me also the importance of it, and also the importance of accurately getting to the bottom of what the actual history was. And that was a big objective of the book that I wrote. And that's part of what I'm trying to bring to this process, is to just help clarify and bring some real precision to what it is we're saying happened in these different places, and hopefully try to be able to honor some of the people who were victimized, and also raise the awareness of people today about the way that the world we live in, even now, was shaped by these events of the past.
Thank you so much. I'm somewhat familiar with this history, and I learned quite a bit, and those images were outstanding. So thank you so much. So we've talked about the history, and now we're going to talk about what happens next and what we are trying to do. And to do that, we will bring in our next set of panelists. First is Donna Stevens. Stevens is very accomplished, but for the purposes of this evening, it's very important to know that she founded the Chattahoochee Brick Company Coalition and serves as chair. And she is going to be in conversation with Dr. Melissa Spite Vaughn. And Dr. Vaughn, or Spite Vaughn, has worked tirelessly and is an expert on this subject, and is also a part of the team moving things forward. So Donna and Melissa, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Cameron.
Thank you, Cameron. So Donna, we are going to have a short little conversation about what we hope to achieve. First, I would like you to just explain how you're involved, or how we're involved with this project.
Okay, 1 second. I'm being filmed. The how am I involved in this effort? I'm a native Atlantan, as I was mentioned earlier in my biography, and I've always known about the Chattahoochee Brick Company. Conversations, men were employed there. You know, you'd say Chattahoochee Brick Company in happenstance. It was always, not always, but frequently discussed, but no one really discussed the history of the place. Again, I've lived there all my life, but it was only until I was able to come across Douglas Blackman's documentary one Saturday with my sister that I learned the true nature of the Chattahoochee Brick Company. I was shocked, mortified, disgusted. It was a roller coaster of emotions for me. Slightly, a few years later, I'm in a board meeting with Groundwork Atlanta, and they discussed Lincoln Terminal had purchased the land, and they were going to build a biofuel center on the property. The environmentalist in me was shook, but also as a African-American female in America, the cultural and historical ramifications were deep. So I had all these emotions tied into that announcement. I partnered up with a fellow volunteer / board member, Bob Kent, and we started speaking out against the development, the proposed development. We attended NPU meetings, City Hall. We spoke to anyone who would listen. We had a strong group of advocates pushing for us. The NPUs voted no for the special permit. City Hall said no. They even took it to the city lawyers who said no on the special use permit. Years later, it popped back up. Norfolk Southern had signed a lease with Lincoln Terminal with almost the identical plans for the property. Bob and I were beside ourselves. This was shortly before COVID broke out. And so we're trying to engage with all these corporations and the city government, and everything's shut down. We can't get anybody on the phone. We can't get any emails answered. And it was really a rough year for us. But the National African American Reparations Commission and FERN, Funds for Reparation Now, caught wind of what we were doing, and they gave us the push we needed. Also, I would like to mention the fact that Douglas Blackman has been by our side the entire time, but so has Derek Bozeman, WAOK, came out and delivered some Facebook Lives, and that garnered even more attention.
Okay. Now, when we talk about what we want to achieve, there are two sites. It's the Bellwood Quarry and the Chattahoochee Brick Company site. So how do you see those as the same, and how do you see them as different?
How do I see them as same? First of all, the
efforts.
The sameness is the fact that they subjected African-American men, women, and children to some of the most horrendous treatments that you could possibly think of. I loaned my copy of Slavery by Another Name to my father, and he read it and he handed it back to me. He said, that truly was worse than slavery. He and I have a father-daughter book club, and we share books quite frequently. And so I knew where he was coming from. And for him to say that had to have been a painful discovery. He just didn't know that those things were going on. Also, the other part with the chain gangs were different in the fact that they were it was a different time and place. I see the Bellwood Quarry, not to make light of it, but it was a more modern treatment of the men. I don't know that much about the Bellwood Quarry as much as I know about Chattahoochee Brick Company, but Chattahoochee Brick Company was truly on the heels of slavery. It was excruciating, the physical and mental terrorism.
Right, and what they're making were different because
there's not really that much of a difference between the two.
Yeah.
One, they were both mandated by the government. They were both subjected to, I'm gathering the Black codes had an influence on the Bellwood Quarry, much like they did the Chattahoochee Brick Company.
What do you think should be remembered about these two places?
I think that I've said it before, and it's almost as if slavery ended and then Dr. King showed up. There's a void in our history, and I don't think people appreciate what the ancestors went through. I can remember growing up and people making jokes about chain gangs and things of that nature, and they shipped him off to Milledgeville, or they did this or they did that in a joking manner. But you have to think about the families that were disrupted, the neighborhoods, the communities, and those types of things. I often think about those women whose husbands left for the day to go and get work or go and get supplies or just simply go down the street, and they were gone within an instance. And let's think about this. The literacy rate was very, very low. These people probably couldn't write a letter. Even if they could, if they did have the tools to write it, they probably wouldn't have allowed them to write a letter. So you have these voids. I often get the question about the descendants in the title of our group and how, am I descendant? And I often say, prove to me that I'm not a descendant, because genealogy is difficult. African-American genealogy is almost impossible. Right. But when you throw convict leasing in and you talk about people who were as young as 10, 12 years old being subjected to this type of treatment and typically dying, the lineage is lost.
Right. Because they probably didn't return. We don't know what happened. Right. Just quickly, I want you to talk about what we hope to achieve in this collaboration, because we have the Chattahoochee Brick Company Descendants Coalition working with the Truth and Transformation Project. So what would you say we want to achieve in that collaboration?
Well, our mission statement is to restore and preserve the Chattahoochee Brick Company site for its uniquely sacred historical and educational value with an environmental justice approach.
Right.
So to memorialize the lives of the people who were subjected to this horrendous practice called convict leasing chain gang would be very much one of the goals for the Chattahoochee Brick Company Descendants Coalition, as well as the Truth and Transformation Group. So with our combined efforts, it's very hopeful that we will be successful in memorializing them in both locations in a way that is
worthy of the sacrifice that they made for
more than a marker.
Right. Thank you, Donna. I enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you.
That concludes our.
Hello, everyone. We have now reached the portion of the evening where we will answer any questions that you might have. So if you'd like to drop those into the chat or in the Q&A section, we'll bring all of our panelists back on and they will do their best to answer questions. I see one that I can actually answer. It says, how can I get a recording? You can do it in two ways. We will have this up on our YouTube page. If you go to YouTube and search for the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, it'll be a few days before it's on there, but you can definitely get it from there. Also, we are on Facebook Live right now, so that will live on our Facebook page as well.
There is a question in the Q&A. Because this panel is focused on the Westside Bellwood, how would you separate other quarries in Fulton County from Bellwood when documenting?
Yeah, and that's one that I'll say on that, that's a challenge because just from a historical perspective, just sorting out with some precision what happened and where is a complicated thing. But there are historical records. There are accounts from that period of time, like some of the newspaper articles that flashed by on the screen earlier. And so we just have to do the work of sifting through a lot of that material and trying to sort out as best we can, and also trying to make distinctions between places where, I mean, I don't think that the work in a quarry in the late 1800s and early 1900s, that was not a fun job for anybody, whether you were a prisoner or whether you chose to work there. But it makes a difference whether you were forced to work there. It makes a difference whether you were being brutalized by the people who ran the place, punished, whipped, starved. And so it's important for us to do our best to make those distinctions as well. But there was a prisoner camp out at the Bellwood Quarry that existed for close to the majority of 100 years. And many thousands of men would have been forced to work there under very difficult circumstances. And so establishing that record is something I think we can do.
Another question in the Q&A is, are there any video or film assets from either period locations?
I'll just answer quickly. I don't know of any film from the period for either of these locations. There actually, and of course, there is a documentary film called Slavery by Another Name that based on the book that I wrote, that's about these sorts of practices all over the South. Actually, since that film came out, which was now 10 years ago, I've more recently discovered some footage that we didn't know existed at the time. That there actually is some footage of convict camps from the 1920s to the 1930s. But the great majority of all this predates moving images, and for sure the kinds of moving images that could have been taken out in these sorts of locations.
And you kind of alluded to this next question in your last answer, but how often did this happen in other states, and how would one research those happenings in other states?
Well, and I don't want to hog all the questions, but it happened basically in all of the southern states. It happened in a very substantial scale in all of the southern states. There was prison labor. There has been prison labor in every American state, but the nature of prison labor in other parts of the country was traditionally very different than what occurred in the South. And what happened in the South was also highly, highly racialized, far more so than in any other part of the country. And so it is a different thing. And the first place to go to research this would be to read my book. But there are also many other, there's a lot of scholarship that's been done about all of this. The very distinctive thing about my book was that I was willing to say, and I think prove to some degree, that it was not just an abusive prison system. It was a reestablishment of a form of slavery, and that what it amounted to was were hundreds of thousands of people over time being forced back into a state of slavery, and who had not committed crimes and then just been punished severely for it. But it was actual slavery.
All right, I think we'll do one more question and then it'll be time to close. This one's coming from Mary. It says, how could the events and people best be memorialized without re-traumatizing people? What aspects should be highlighted?
Y'all are gonna make me go.
I'll
repeat
take
it.
a
Go ahead, Melissa.
stab. I'll take a stab at it, only because I think this is very important. It is a painful part of our history, but the memorialization, from my perspective, would be for those that suffered, those that labored, those that perished in the systems, in some way of just recognizing that they were here, that they impacted this world. The whole system should be remembered, because this does, just like Doug said, tell kind of where we've been as human beings, how we treat one another. We can always learn lessons from that. Donna, you want to add?
So maybe the nature of convict leasing needs to be studied by educators and adults before presented to children. This is definitely something that you just wouldn't give a kindergartner. It needs to be presented in a way that's age appropriate. Like most subjects, children are inquisitive and want to learn. And also there might be some, I'm reminded of some of the movies that have come out over the years and where convict leasing was suggested, chain gangs were suggested, songs. Jails are part of our culture. So I don't see, and children are, I don't want to say they're resilient, but there is a part of childhood where you are introduced to people who go to jail and you learn about jails. So, and that can be traumatizing. So I think that with the right people and the right curriculums, that yes, we could educate people about this. I didn't learn about the massacre of 1906 until I was in college, and I'm a native Atlantan. Was I traumatized? I don't want to say I was traumatized, but I was very shocked. And I was somewhat bitter because I was an adult at Georgia State University and literally footsteps away from where the massacre occurred, and had never heard of it before. And those types of things can make you angry. Chattahoochee Brick Company is less than a mile from my home. I didn't know the nature of convict leasing that occurred there. I think that we need to know these things, however traumatic they may be.
Yeah, I would agree with my friends and colleagues that it's important for us to know these things and for us to explore that history so that we can understand what we think we already know more fully, right? Whatever you think you know, you don't know much about the history of this nation and this region and this city in particular, if you don't know this really important and significant chapter, because it informs. It is informed by what came before it, and it informs, quite frankly, the situation that we find ourselves in today, even the carceral state that we are confronted with now, the disproportionate representation of Black bodies still within that space. I would say, though, that I think one of the things that we have recognized as a partnership is that we have a responsibility to our friends and neighbors to not just stridently suggest that this is the history and you have to deal with it, and we don't care what it means to traumatize or upset people with regard to that. Particularly when we talk about traumatization, a lot of times it's not about, I want to make a distinction between learning something unpleasant and feeling actually personally wounded and injured as a consequence of that. And I think that one of the things that we often do is we pay a lot of attention to folks who maybe don't want to hear things that are unpleasant or might bring up narratives about which they personally don't feel proud, versus understanding what it means to cause injury to people who feel particularly close to this, whose ancestors or even personally who might be wounded by these historical realities and what they mean in the present. And so we have to take care with one another to make sure that we are not basically affirming the values, right, and inequities that came before by suggesting that sharing this information as an object lesson for somebody who might be more distant is worth injuring somebody who might be closer to the history. There's an interesting and difficult tightrope that we have to walk. I would say the same with the other prong of this work, which is about the 1906 Race Massacre, and understanding that when we talk about victims, right, sometimes we're talking about people who were personally directly impacted, somebody who was personally violently attacked, killed. But we are also understanding that the intention of these efforts was to marginalize, silence, traumatize, subordinate an entire community. So when you talk about the victims, you're not just talking about those people whose names are counted. You're also talking about a wider community who got the message that if you step out of line in terms of this racial hierarchy, if you talk back, if you try to exercise your rights, then these are the things that could happen to you. That in and of itself is also traumatic.
You know, Kalinda, I'll add one last little thing to that too, is that in terms of who the victims are, what you just said is exactly right. They're the direct, tangible victims, the people who were injured in these events. And then there's this circle of people close to them and around them and their descendants who are injured in less direct ways. But there's also an injury from all these things that happens to the entire community, and in a weird way happens to the people who did the bad things and their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. When these things happen in the past, and then lies and deceptions are locked in around them that are aimed at obscuring the past, it locks a community into generational deceptions and generational lies. And because people end up feeling that, well, I have to keep telling this lie that I know at some level perhaps can't be quite true, but I have to keep telling it because it's a lie that my family depends on for how it views itself, or it's a lie that is necessary to protect the way that the love that I feel for, in some cases, people I never knew. After my book first came out, that picture that you saw earlier of Joel Hurt, very famous Atlanta figure from the early 20th century, that picture's in the book. And I got a letter from one of his great grandchildren afterwards who said, I've had that same picture on the wall in my house all of my life. It was on the wall all of my childhood in my parents' house. And now I understand things about him and the fortune that, that I have some connections to that I never understood. And it's painful. I'm paraphrasing, but this is pretty close to the actual words. She says, deeply painful, but thank you for helping me to actually know the truth about these things. And so the victims are also people who were on the other side of the equation eventually. And anytime we get locked in a cycle of self-deception and lying about these sorts of things, it's incredibly corrosive to our society. And not to be political, but that's part of what's so dangerous about the war on teaching honest history that's happening right now on a lot of fronts, is that we have to be honest about these things, or we condemn all of ourselves, and at worse, we condemn our children and our grandchildren.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists, as well as everyone who is in attendance tonight. We are a little over time, so we'll start wrapping up. Thank you so much again to our panelists. That was wonderful. I truly appreciate you taking the time to talk with our audience. And thank you to PNC for sponsoring not just this program, but our Black History Month at the Center as well. Again, thank you so much for spending your Wednesday evening with us, and have a wonderful rest of your night.